Have you ever bought something so expensive, so life-defining, that it seemed to change the way you carried yourself? Today, it might be a house, a luxury car, or even a wedding, a once-in-a-lifetime expense that isn't just about the money, but about what it says to the world. In the Middle Ages, for a knight, that object wasn't a castle or even a horse. It was a suit of armor, a second skin of gleaming steel, heavy enough to stop a sword and polished enough to catch the eye of a king. But the true cost of medieval armor? It was never just about gold. It was paid in sweat, in years of training, in whispered secrets passed down through guarded hands, and in the hidden labor of hundreds of lives that most knights would never meet. Did we tend to imagine armor as a simple product of its time? A blacksmith in a smoky forge hammering metal until it takes shape. The reality was far stranger, more intricate, and more expensive than most people realize. The story began far from the battlefield, in the deep black silence beneath the earth. Specialized iron or wasn't just scraped from the surface. It had to be mined from veins that were rare, dangerous to reach, and jealously guarded by those who controlled them. These were not open fields, but claustrophobic shafts where men worked by the light of flickering tallow lamps. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of earth and sweat, and every creak of timber could mean the roof was about to come down. One wrong sound could trigger a collapse. One careless breath could inhale poison from the rock, and this was no ordinary ore. Armorers prized certain deposits for their purity, others for trace minerals that seemed to give the steel unusual strength or resilience. Sometimes small amounts of other metals, copper, tin, even nickel, were deliberately mixed in, creating alloys that had their own personalities in the forge. Where those recipes came from was a matter of speculation even in the Middle Ages. Some believed they were inherited from Roman smiths who had long vanished. Others whispered that such knowledge came from older sources, fragments of texts looted from distant lands, or even secrets so ancient their origins had been lost to memory. Guild records were silent on the matter, perhaps deliberately. Once mined, the ore began its transformation in the smith's domain. But entry into that world was a privilege reserved for the few. To join an armorer's guild, a boy would often begin at 12 or 13, not with a hammer, but with a broom. Years of sweeping, fetching water, and stoking the forge taught him the rhythm of the work before he was allowed to touch metal. Knowledge was passed in gestures, in silences, in the way a master inspected the curve of a plate or listened to the sound it made under the hammer. Written instructions were rare. A master's secrets might die with him if no worthy apprentice had earned them. The work itself was a dialogue between man and metal. Ore was smelted into ingots, then heated until it glowed white, hammered flat, heated again, quenched, and hammered once more. The heat-treating process was as much alchemy as science. Some armorers quenched plates in water from specific springs, believing minerals in the water affected the steel's strength. Others used oil, brine, or even wine, each said to give the armor unique qualities. Rumors circulated of quenching in animal blood, which supposedly bonded the armor to the warrior. Whether these methods were superstition or early metallurgy, they were kept as trade secrets, fiercely guarded within the guild walls. Yet a suit of armor was never the work of one man alone. It was the product of an entire medieval assembly line, though no one at the time would have called it that. Leather workers crafted straps and harnesses so the plates wouldn't cut into flesh. Tailors stitched the padded gambesons worn underneath, garments that absorbed sweat and softened impacts. Mail makers forged interlocking rings for the joints, where solid plates would hinder movement. Metal rivets, buckles, and hinges were made by other specialists entirely. Even the polishing, which could take weeks, might be done by someone who had never touched a forge. Every single step cost time, and time was the most expensive resource of all. A true custom-fitted suit of armor could take months, even more than a year, to finish. This wasn't simply because of the labor, but because of the precision required. A plate just a fraction too tight at the neck could choke a man mid-charge. One that hung too loose at the shoulder could catch an enemy's weapon and twist a joint out of place. The armor had to move as the knight moved, every plate and rivet designed for a single human body. It was a wearable machine, and each flaw could mean death. And then there were the invisible costs, those that existed long before the first hammer struck. Raw materials had to be brought in from distant mines, sometimes transported across dangerous roads patrolled by thieves or hostile forces. Charcoal and coal had to be hauled to the forges. Workshops had to be maintained, fed, and kept safe from fire. The smith's apprentices had to eat, live, and be clothed during years in which they produced nothing of value for sale. Every step of the process was a weight on the balance, raising the price of a suit of armor into a realm few could afford. By the time it was finished, a full set of bespoke plate wasn't just protection. It was a statement, a walking declaration of wealth, status, and power. Even in war, the armor announced its wearer before his sword ever touched an opponent. The knight inside it might be unknown, but the gleam of that steel told a story. Here is someone whose life, or whose patron's fortune, is worth more than yours. Yet this was only one layer of the cost. Because for a knight, armor wasn't only an investment in survival. It was a gamble, and sometimes the debt it left behind was one that could never truly be repaid. The truth is, a knight's armor was never truly his alone. From the moment the first ore was pried from the earth to the instant the final rivet was set, it passed through the hands of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people. We imagine the knight as a lone figure in shining steel, but in reality, he was wearing the collective work of an entire society. If you could trace the armor backward, like unwinding a thread, it would lead not to one forge, but to an invisible network that stretched across the medieval world. The armorers, of course, stood at the center of this web. But surrounding them was an entire constellation of trades that rarely appear in romantic paintings of knights. Tanners softened and shaped leather so the armor could be strapped snugly without cutting into flesh. Tailors worked with quilted linen and padded wool to create gambesons that absorbed the bruising force of blows. Blacksmiths who never forged armor still made the countless buckles, clasps, and hinges that kept the plates articulated. Mail makers crafted tens of thousands of tiny rings for the joints. Work so repetitive it was said some could close their eyes and keep weaving chain by touch alone. And then there were the suppliers, the miners, charcoal burners, and transporters. Charcoal, the lifeblood of the forge, had to be produced in great heaps, each slow burn lasting days. The wood had to be cut in vast quantities from managed forests, forests that, in some regions, existed solely to feed the forges. In a sense, the knight's armor began as trees, as soil, as the sweat of men who would never set foot in the battlefield, yet whose labor still lived in the steel. All of this took time, more time than most modern people can imagine for a single piece of equipment. A blacksmith might work for weeks just on a breastplate, heating and hammering, cooling and reshaping, over and over until the metal lay perfectly against the pattern. A master mail maker could take up to 4 months to produce the chainmail. Sleeves alone, from start to finish, a truly bespoke suit could take over a year, with multiple artisans working in parallel. And unlike today's factories, there was no mechanized precision. Each part was made by human hands, each imperfection, judged by the eye and corrected with the hammered to the modern ear. The cost of this might sound unbelievable. Historians estimate that in the 15th century, a full suit of top-quality plate armor could cost the equivalent of a small farm. Others argue that the finest sets rivaled the price of a modest house. One royal armorer's account book from the mid-1400s shows commissions that, when adjusted for modern currency, approached the cost of luxury sports cars, or even more. The richest knights and nobles could afford multiple suits, each for a different type of combat, tournament, or ceremonial display. For everyone else, the cost was ruinous. Many knights never paid for their own armor in full. Some inherited it from fathers or uncles, passed down like a family crown. Others relied on the patronage of lords or kings, receiving armor as part of a feudal agreement in exchange for loyalty and service. But for those without such backing, acquiring armor could mean taking on crushing debt, borrowing from moneylenders, pledging land, or mortgaging future earnings. A knight who died in battle often left his family with a suit of armor more valuable than the home they lived in, and sometimes it was sold immediately to pay off what he owed for it. The expenses didn't end with the initial purchase. Armor was not eternal. Joints wore down, straps broke, plates dented under heavy blows. Repairs were constant, and maintenance was a ritual. Polishing was essential, not for vanity, but to prevent rust from eating through the steel. Neglect could turn a suit of armor into a useless relic in a matter of months. For a knight on campaign, keeping armor in fighting condition meant paying for smiths, leatherworkers, and mail repairers to travel with the army. Yet there was an unspoken truth. In the medieval mind, armor was never only about protection. It was about presence. To ride into a village in polished steel was to radiate authority and dominance. For peasants who had never seen a king, the knight's armor was the king's presence made tangible. For other knights, it was a subtle challenge, a gleam of wealth and craftsmanship that said, without words, I am better equipped than you. In this way, armor became part of a strange economy, one that was not just about money, but about hierarchy. Owning it elevated a man above those who fought without it. And the armor industry itself, the miners, smiths, merchants, was woven into the broader fabric of medieval trade, influencing entire towns. A single wealthy patron could sustain an entire guild for years. A war could enrich not only the victors, but also the craftsmen who outfitted both sides. Still, for all its prestige and power, armor carried a shadow. The greater its cost, the greater the burden it placed on those who sought it. And as warfare evolved, that burden began to outweigh its value. For the knight, the question became, would this fortress of steel protect him or bankrupt him? By the late Middle Ages, the age of the knight was already beginning to fade. The very armor that had once made a man nearly invincible was being undone, not by neglect, not by cost, but by innovation. The longbow, with its armor-piercing arrows, could punch through plate at close range. Crossbows, easier to use and deadly accurate, leveled the battlefield between trained knights and common soldiers. And then came the cannon, a weapon that didn't care how finely your breastplate was forged. It could shatter stone walls. Steel was nothing to it in a sense. The decline of armor was inevitable. As weapons grew deadlier and more affordable, the logic of spending a fortune on a suit of plate became harder to justify. By the 16th century, many soldiers wore only partial armor, breastplates, helmets, or abandoned it entirely in favor of speed and mobility. Full plate became ceremonial, worn in tournaments or parades rather than battlefields. The knight's shining steel, once the apex of military technology, became a symbol of the past. Yet the story didn't end there. The principles behind armor, deflection of force, energy absorption, layered protection, never truly vanished. You can see them today in the body armor worn by soldiers and riot police, in the crash helmets of motorcyclists, even in the padding beneath a modern athlete's uniform. Materials have changed, steel replaced by Kevlar, titanium, advanced polymers, but the thinking is the same. The body is fragile, the world is dangerous, and protection is worth the cost, perhaps. That's why armor continues to capture our imagination. Reenactment groups and jousting tournaments still commission suits from modern armorers, who use centuries-old techniques alongside modern tools. Collectors pay fortunes for surviving medieval pieces, not only because they are beautiful, but because they are time machines, forged in an age when each rivet and curve was shaped by human hands. Even in fiction, armor still holds its power. The gleam of a hero's breastplate, the faceless visor of an enemy, the idea that a human can become something more than flesh and bone by encasing himself in an unbreakable shell. But behind the romance, the legend, and the gleam, the truth remains. Armor was never just a suit of metal. It was an artifact of an entire civilization, its economy, its technology, its hierarchies, its fears. It represented the lengths to which a society would go to keep its warriors alive, and the price it was willing to pay for the illusion of invincibility. For the knight who wore it, armor was both shield and shackle. It could save his life or ruin it. And in that paradox lies the real cost, not measured in coins or gold, but in the hidden toll it took on everyone who lived in its shadow. Even today, we still wrestle with that question. How much protection is enough, and what price are we willing to pay for it? The knights of old answered with steel, sweat, and sacrifice. Our answer is still being forged. If you enjoyed uncovering the hidden history behind the armor, make sure to like this video, share it with others who love medieval mysteries, and subscribe for more deep dives into the secrets history tried to forget. And tell us in the comments, if you lived in the Middle Ages, would you wear the armor or face battle without it?